What is the scariest thing you have ever seen in your life that you cannot explain? This is the biggest unexplained thing that happened in my life, and I'm thankful it did. When I was in high school, my parents went out together on an errand, and my dad was usually the one driving them around. But on the way home, my mom oddly insisted on driving, and they stopped at a light to turn left, leading into a busy intersection. When the light turned green, she just didn't move. Cars behind her honked, and my dad asked why she wasn't moving. She just stared ahead at the light and said nothing, until a stolen pickup truck flew through the intersection just feet in front of them, running the red light and going at least 80 miles per hour with a few police cars in pursuit. Both of my parents believe they wouldn't have survived that accident if she had actually pulled out when the light turned green. To this day, she can't explain why every instinct told her to freeze and not move into the intersection for her turn. She pulled over and called me and my brother, sobbing, trying to prepare us for what we'd need to do if something happened to them. It was really scary. My parents have always been rock solid, fearless people, but that one event changed them both. Weirdly enough, this happened to me twice since then, too. Once was at 11 p.m. at a four-way stop in a small town. I just sat there and didn't move forward. Wedged between buildings, I couldn't see much traffic on either side, it seemed quiet. But I hesitated for like 5 whole seconds because I had this horrific feeling of dread that I couldn't explain. Then a minivan flew in front of us with a cop in pursuit. The other time was in Seattle, stopped at a busy intersection at the bottom of one of the big hills. I was driving again, and my husband gently pointed out that the light had turned green. I couldn't move, though. That same panicked feeling was back, and a huge transit van went flying down the hill, running their red light, right where we would have been if I'd gone through. Maybe it's an instinct we don't fully grasp yet, who knows? Has anyone else ever had this type of premonition type, life-saving event happen? Years ago, I was out in the field doing some tillage on a cornfield. It was about 2:30 a.m. when suddenly, the tractor came to a dead stop, killing the motor and all the lights. Figuring the ripper, a deep tillage farm implement, had hit a large rock, I turned the tractor back on, lifted up the ripper, and drove ahead a bit so I could get out and see what might have happened. I found the problem. It was indeed a rock. I decided to test whether or not I could lift the rock and put it on top of the ground so it'd be easily seen when we came to pick it up in daylight. The rock didn't budge at all, so I kicked some dirt from around the edges, hoping I could break it loose. No luck. So, I dug a little more dirt and discovered it was at least 3 feet across and would require equipment to dig out and move. At this point, most of the upper surface area of the rock was exposed, but a good 80% was still completely buried, about 2 feet deep. For comparison, imagine taking a truck motor, digging a 2-foot hole, placing it in the hole but leaving the top exposed. That's pretty close to what I was facing here. I went back to the tractor, got some flags, and marked the spot so we could easily drive to it with the loader tractor. Ready to get back to tillage, I put the tractor in gear and dropped the ripper back into the ground. We make rounds for our tillage, so on my way back south on the next pass, I looked at the spot where the rock incident had happened, and somehow that rock had been lifted out of the hole and placed on top of the ground. I'd never had a visible, or real, reason to be creeped out until that moment. I ran through all the possible scenarios in my head that could explain what I was seeing, like one of the ripper shanks somehow catching the rock and lifting it out. But the problem with any theory was that I was already past the rock and had never set the ripper down near it after realizing it couldn't be dug out by hand. Gives me chills to this day when I think about it. My great-grandma passed away when I was 10. When we went to the funeral, for some reason, we stayed at her house, where she had just passed away. She had a grandfather clock in the living room that hadn't worked in years. Our first night, at midnight, the clock began to chime, going through all 12 chimes as we all woke up and started to freak out. The clock never chimed again, and we're all convinced it was Grandma telling us she was okay. Back in high school, my friend and I used to spend every Friday night at various car club scenes. One night, we got back to his house around 2 a.m. It was a clear, quiet night in the neighborhood with no one around. He lived on a flat, straight road where you could see anyone coming up or down the street and sidewalk. We weren't ready to go to sleep just yet, so we sat on the trunk of his car in the driveway, chilling and talking about the evening. To our right, his neighbor had one large magnolia tree in the lawn, but no lights or anything that could play shadow tricks on us. As we were sitting there, I caught something move to our right. A dark figure, easily 8 feet tall, was just standing under that tree. At the same time, I could feel my friend tense up next to me. Neither of us spoke for what felt like an eternity until he quietly asked me, still looking straight ahead like me, "Did you just see something over there?" "Yeah," I whispered. He asked if I was ready to go inside. "Yeah," I said. We got up, neither of us wanting to look over at that tree, and briskly walked inside. I can still feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up when I recall that night. Something compelled both of us not to look or investigate, just to go inside. And that's the creepiest part to me. Not really scary, but I can't explain it. It was 2013, and my dad had just picked me up from private school. I was in 2nd grade. We stopped so I could get a Krispy Kreme donut, which I loved. When we left the store and I got in the car, I got into the back seat on the passenger side, like I always did. But for some reason, my father told me to sit on his side of the back seat. I thought it was odd but didn't think much of it. On our way home, we passed by a major intersection. There was an ambulance behind us with its lights and siren on, so we had to go through a red light. The next thing I remember is waking up in a hospital. Someone had hit our car when we went through that light. I was in the hospital for a few days or a week, I don't remember. My father showed me pictures of the car we were in. The passenger side was completely smashed in. The rear passenger seat was crushed. Had my father not told me to change seats, I wouldn't have survived. My father had never told me to change seats before, and he never did again. I once had an office on the top floor of an old plantation-style mansion-turned-office building. I would often work alone there at night. I'm not really a ghost believer, but these experiences sure scared me. Each rectangular floor had about 30 to 40 doors. Some were small, little micro-offices, and some connected to form bigger offices. The first thing that happened was one night, at approximately 10 p.m., a door slammed ridiculously hard on my floor, so aggressive and loud that it had to have caused damage to the office it was in. It startled me and paralyzed me in fear. About 5 minutes later, I gathered the courage to do a round of my floor. Every single door was locked, and none were visibly damaged. A few weeks later, I brought my very calm, introverted puppy with me. This puppy hardly ever barked and was really hard to provoke. He was a terrible guard dog, because he wouldn't even bark or get that interested in people coming or going from his own house. Myself and a colleague from a music studio on the basement floor of this place were sitting in my office when suddenly my puppy ran out of the office to the corner hallway, which pointed down a long, dark corridor, where the slam had come from, and just started violently barking in a way I had never seen him do before, nor after, for the rest of his life. I'd estimate that he barked as loud and energetically as he could, deadlocked with his eyes down that hallway for at least a solid minute. My colleague and I sat paralyzed, looking at each other for a few minutes, not knowing what to say. He helped me pack up all my things right then and there, and I moved my office out of that building and got off the lease the next day. I've never been back, and I don't ever want to go back. I'm not the only one who worked there and experienced weird stuff either. I was riding my bike down a rural road when I was 9 and found a garbage bag filled with red sludge and white sticks. I thought it was blood and bones, but I had a very PG childhood and had never even seen pretend blood and bones, so I had nothing to compare it to. I told myself it wasn't what I thought it was. After all, why would there be a ripped open garbage bag filled with blood and bones? 2 days later, I thought, look again, and if it is what you think it is, tell a grown-up. I biked back to the area, and it was gone. I'm older now and have seen enough to confirm, it was blood and bones. My best friend and I would always talk about crazy dreams we had. I never thought much of it until he told me about one where he got hit by a car and lost his life. We were about 15 or 16 when he told me about the dream. We were into conspiracies, stuff like aliens, the paranormal, lucid dreaming, so we'd talk about things like that a lot, and he passed away right before he would have turned 20. He said he was riding a skateboard, wearing all black, when the car hit him. In the dream, he could see everyone at his funeral. He even joked about how his crush was there. He kept going on about how real it felt, and it shook me up for a while until, eventually, I forgot about it. Then, a few years later, after I'd long forgotten about the dream he told me, it happened for real. His crush was at his funeral. He did get hit by a car and pass away. He was wearing all black, his work clothes, and he was riding my skateboard. It was all true. Every single detail I remember from his dream came true, and I'm sure there are parts he told me that I don't remember. I felt crazy. I didn't tell anyone about it, I just don't know why or how he saw it happen in his dream. I think, what if he never told me about it? It left me with so many questions, but I guess now I have proof, at least to myself, that our souls go on after we pass. I just wish I knew why he had that dream and told me about it, like there had to be some reason. I just think about how I wouldn't believe this story if I hadn't experienced it myself. Has anyone ever experienced anything similar? This isn't something seen but heard. About a year ago, I was in bed at home in my apartment at around 10 p.m., just on the edge of sleep, when I heard, very distinctly behind me, the sound of someone else in my double bed. It was the clear, unmistakable sound of breathing, followed by a small rustling of sheets. I was facing away from the bed, so the sound was behind me. It didn't scare me immediately, but about 5 seconds later, I remembered that I lived alone. That shot me wide awake. I searched my whole room, but there was no one there. Ordinarily, I'd have just dismissed it as a hypnagogic hallucination, but it lines up with about 10 other things. A flatmate who stayed for a brief while once asked me early on if I was moving furniture in the night because the scraping was keeping her up. I'd been asleep. My boyfriend and I once came home and heard a door close inside the apartment as we entered. We searched the whole place, but there was no one there, and we couldn't find a closed internal door either. I had a constant sense of being watched, and so did my boyfriend, though for him, it felt aggressive, while for me, it felt mostly benign. The final straw came when my boyfriend took a nap at my place while I was out, in the same bed where I'd heard the breathing, and something rested a hand on his side. He actually linked hands with whatever it was, and he said he felt like he was going to lose his life. And yet, somehow, I never saw more than shadows out of the corner of my eye. We concluded that the apartment was haunted by something that liked me but wasn't a fan of my boyfriend, so I recently moved out to live with him. I left my ghost protector a candle as a goodbye gift. When I was 9 years old, I was biking home in the evening. We lived in the countryside up a small mountain. The road from the village was an uphill, a flat section, and then another uphill. The road lights only stretched to the end of the flat section. I was a bit afraid of the dark, so I stopped at the end of the road lights, just at the bottom of the last uphill, to gather the courage to bike the last section home. It was a partial moon, so it wasn't pitch black, and at the end of the uphill, I saw a figure walking down toward me. I thought I'd wait until they got closer, as I'd feel less afraid to bike in the dark if someone else was nearby. But about halfway down the hill, the person walked into the thin shadow of a tree on the road and never came back out. Just disappeared. I stood there for a while, trying to figure out what I'd just seen, then panicked and biked back down to the village. I stayed there until my parents came driving, wondering why I never came home. They tried to explain it away, saying the person might have gone into the woods or something. What they didn't disclose, out of fear that I'd never bike home again, was that my father had seen the same thing walking home from work. He'd seen her clear as day, walking down the hill for a while. When he looked down for just a second and looked up, she was gone, and there were no footsteps in the fresh snow. The basement in my dad's house is finished except for the storage room, which is really dark and creepy and is around the corner from the main room of the basement. There's an elliptical down there, and when standing on it, if you look over your shoulder, you can see half of the door to the storage room. I was working out on the elliptical and felt like someone was standing behind me, so I looked over my shoulder, and in that half doorway, a dark figure with light gray eyes was standing there, looking at me. I was house sitting, so I knew no one else was home. I slowly got off the elliptical and went into the bathroom to hide. After a while, I decided to be bold, rushed past the storage room, and went back upstairs. That wasn't the first time I'd seen that gray-eyed figure, either. I was about to cross the street when a lady put her arm across my chest and said, "Wait." As I looked at her, trying to figure out what was going on, a car crash happened, and one of the cars went tumbling down the street, 2 feet in front of me. If she hadn't stopped me, I would absolutely have been hit. I turned to look at her again, and she was gone. I could see for blocks in each direction, and there was no place she could have disappeared to that quickly without me seeing her. The only explanation I can come up with is that I imagined her in my memory due to how traumatic the crash was. I've never experienced anything even slightly supernatural before or since. So, in college, I studied in the UK. I lived in a house with a group of other American students, and there were stories about the ghost of a girl who'd passed away while living there. I never really believed any of it, but it was fun to play along. The kitchen had one way in and out, and just to the right after you entered was a padlocked door to the cellar where she allegedly lived. I had the only key. Near Thanksgiving, we were all feeling a bit homesick and decided to make a meal together. With the small appliances in the kitchen, we had to get creative with cooking schedules. One girl who didn't have class the next day offered to stay up late to get the turkey started. That evening, we went into the cellar for the first, and only, time to get larger cooking implements. At 2:04 in the morning, I woke up to my door rattling, like someone was pushing against it. I assumed it was a housemate who had gone to the wrong door. About 30 seconds later, I heard a scratchy female voice softly saying, "Hello," every 5 seconds or so. My window was open, and it sounded like it was coming from outside, so I got up to close it, assuming it was some drunk girl walking back from the pub. I got to the window, saw no one, and then heard, "Hello," clear as a bell behind me. My door rattled again, then went silent. I've had night terrors before and sometimes hallucinate when I have even a mild fever, so I figured I must still be asleep and lay back down. The next morning at 7 a.m., the girl who was cooking told me, I had the creepiest night. At 1:50, I heard footsteps coming up the cellar stairs, then the door rattled. Then, at 2:10, the door rattled again, and I heard footsteps going down. She told me this before I'd mentioned anything to anyone about what I'd experienced. About 25 years ago, my now former wife and I were caretaking a house. We'd been there for several weeks, and we both noticed that every time we came up the stairs from the cellar, we'd get that feeling like something was going to grab you as soon as you turned off the light switch. Everything else about the house was normal. We slept with an analog wind-up alarm clock next to the bed, the kind that actually ticks. To set the alarm, you move a tiny third hand to the location on the clock face for the desired time, like halfway between 6 and 7 for 6:30. It's a physical process, and there's very little way to get it wrong. We always had the clock set to wake us up at 6 a.m. and didn't adjust it daily. One night, the alarm clock went off at around 2 in the morning, with the old school ringing bells. Both my former wife and I woke up absolutely terrified. I saw a small figure, maybe 2 feet tall, run out of the room. I thought I must have been seeing things, until my former wife screamed, "Did you just see that thing?" We both described it as some sort of small gremlin. When we looked at the alarm clock, we saw that the alarm hand had been moved from 6 a.m. to 2 a.m. That's the whole story. It scared me so much. I have no explanation for it. Nothing else ever happened there, but that feeling in the cellar persisted. My grandfather had just passed away a few days earlier, and one night, my mom was crying in our kitchen. I started hugging her. We had a lot of my grandfather's belongings, but there was this broken radio on the table that didn't even have working batteries, along with other things like photos and clothes he had owned. This is the only unexplainable thing I've ever experienced, but while my mom was sobbing, the radio made a very loud static noise for about a second. We both stared in silence at it. It was eerie. She stopped crying because she heard it too. We both just went to bed after that and haven't spoken of it since. I'd imagine if it was something paranormal, it was my grandfather letting us know he was there, but who knows. I lived in a shared house for a while, and one night I was sitting with one of the housemates when he started telling me that whenever he had pictures taken, there would be tiny white dots that covered him, not just on his skin but also across his clothes. He proceeded to show me many examples in his phone's gallery, and sure enough, at first the pictures looked normal, but when you zoomed in, he was covered in these tiny white dots, just as he described. When other people were in the pictures with him, he was the only one with these dots on him. He also added that this only ever occurred when he had relapsed on drugs. He didn't have to be high at the time, but during that time period, they would appear. I was obviously skeptical that this was anything strange, so I decided to test it myself. I asked one of the other people living in the house to take pictures of us. We stood together, and in some pictures, I made sure my arm was around him, etc. Sure enough, when zoomed in, there were hundreds, maybe thousands, of tiny white dots only on him, almost as if they were floating in front of him on both his skin and clothes. But not a single one was on me. I was starting to get a bit more concerned at this point, so I had him change his t-shirt and put one of mine on, and I got a wet cloth to wipe down his arms. Then we had the other housemate take all new pictures. It didn't matter what I did, the dots were always there in the pictures and only ever on him. His theory was that it was his dad, who had passed away, trying to tell him he needed to change his life. This happened about 8 years ago, and I still think about that night often, as it was by far the most unexplainable thing I've ever witnessed. Anyone with a good explanation for this phenomenon, I'd love to hear it. I am a massive skeptic, and that night shook me up. Most of my childhood was spent in a rural South Korean town, so there were a lot of old buildings and random burial mounds you'd find in the woods near the rice paddies. There were several creepy events, but this one was shared between me and 4 other girls. My friends and I decided to hike into the mountains behind one friend's house. We were all there that day because it was her birthday, and we'd gotten bored of watching our parents socialize. She lived on a fairly tall mountain with rice paddies that terraced up one entire side, so we figured there had to be a road the farmers used to get to the peak, and we were right. The start of the road was near a monastery that looked like it had been abandoned mid-construction, which was pretty cool to see up close. The first 10 minutes of the hike were great, we were pretending it was a grand adventure and laughing. On the way up, we specifically stopped to point out a weird scarecrow. We had never seen one in person before, and none of the rice paddies we played around in, and sometimes in, uncles, had one, so it was memorable. A very classic strawman scarecrow, with its head flopped forward and a big hat. Something about it made us feel weird, but it was probably a couple of minutes after we continued onward, with the scarecrow out of sight, that we all felt something had changed. The forest around us had gone dead silent, and it made us all stop in unison, not a word exchanged between us. We didn't even look at each other, just froze. I'm not even sure which one of us said we should turn back, only that we all turned and backtracked slowly, swiveling our heads to look out. We'd only gone about 5 minutes past the scarecrow, just far enough to have it out of sight when we went around a bend in the road. Then we saw it again, and it no longer had a head, poof, gone. And it was still dead silent. The scarecrow was in the middle of a paddy, where there was nowhere for a person to hide, and we were all close enough to hear any sound from the water and mud if someone had waded in. We all knew from experience that walking through that mud was tough, your feet would sometimes get glued into it. And its head hadn't fallen off, the rice was still young, and we could see the water around its pole. We all began running, not speaking, not yelling, just pure terror. When we got to the start of the trail, among the half-finished Buddhist motifs, the birdsong and cicadas suddenly sounded so loud after the silence. We went back to the birthday girl's house, interrupted the adults to go home, and never spoke of what happened on that hike. We all pretended it never happened. When I was a child, both my parents went to work early, so they would drop me off at my grandmother's to eat breakfast, and I'd go to school from there. My grandmother passed away during my junior year in high school, and I started coming straight home from school. Around this time, my mother started complaining that when she got home from work, the receiver of the phone, an 80s-style corded push-button phone, next to her bed was left off the base. I wasn't using the phone, but she insisted I must have been because it was always hung up properly when she left for work. One day, I got home a little early. Now, I need to tell you about the layout of our apartment. From the front door, I could see directly into the living room, dining room, the door to the kitchen, and the short hallway that led to my parents' bedroom and my bedroom. There was no other door, the windows were old-fashioned narrow casement windows with screens, and we were on the 3rd floor. Anyway, as soon as I walked in the door, I clearly heard 2 footsteps in my parents' bedroom. I dropped my school bag and, foolishly, ran to the bedroom. It wasn't far, just a few seconds away. When I got there, no one was there. However, I immediately noticed that the receiver of the phone on my mother's bedside table was on the floor. It was positioned so that the cord to the base was stretched as far as it could go. I later tried to replicate the placement by shaking the table, tipping the phone, etc., but I could never get the receiver to fall like that. When I finally resorted to knocking it off with a finger, it would fall on the table or next to it. The only way I could replicate the position I found it in was to carefully stretch the cord, place it, and hold it for a few moments. It couldn't have landed there by accident. When I found the phone, I hung it up, and it immediately rang. I answered, and it was my dad. He asked what was wrong. I asked him why he thought something was wrong. He said he had called, apparently just before I got home, and someone, he thought it was me, answered the phone but didn't say anything. He finally hung up and had been trying to call back, only getting through after I'd hung up the phone. I've never figured out what happened. I definitely heard footsteps, and I'm just as certain no one was there. No one went past me. The windows in the bedroom were undisturbed, and my parents had so much stuff under the bed and in the closet that no one bigger than an infant could hide there. And after this, my mother never found the phone disturbed again. Driving home from a concert at 2 a.m. When I was 19, I saw what looked like a red dot in the sky. All of a sudden, there was a flash in my eyes, my whole truck shook, and my windshield cracked. I was temporarily blinded and almost wrecked because I couldn't see where I was going. After my eyesight came back, I continued driving home, about 5 more minutes, and parked my truck. I couldn't see anything in the dark, and I was exhausted. When I woke up in the morning, I went to check out my truck. The hood had a huge dent in it, and the paint was burned off a 6-inch section. The metal was blue and purple, like you see when steel gets heated. My windshield had a small section where the outer layer of glass was gone, and the plastic layer in the middle was melted. There's nothing else I've ever come up with that could have hit it with such heat and energy. At a stoplight, waiting to make a left turn. There are 2 turning lanes. I'm in the inner lane, and another car is in the outer lane. The light turns green, and as I'm turning, the car in the outer lane speeds up, makes a U-turn, but loses control and is about to hit me. Bracing for impact, I honk at the car and slam the brakes, hoping to minimize the collision. I feel a cold splash from the iced tea I had in the cup holder and look down. When I look up, the light is still red, and both my car and the other car are still waiting behind the traffic white line. When it turns green, I don't press the gas pedal, and sure enough, the car in the outer lane speeds up and almost hits the inner cement island trying to correct the U-turn. As I wait, I look down, and my tea is spilled all over. I don't know what or how it happened, but it freaked me out for days. I have no explanation for what happened. Needless to say, I now drive further to avoid that left turn. My friend and I were driving back from a gig we played in Kona on the Big Island of Hawaii. We were on Saddle Road, one of the 2 roads from Kona to the other side of the island, to Hilo Town. Saddle Road is known for being a spiritual place with lots of strange happenings. This stretch of land is about 40 kilometers with no lights or population, just lava rock. We were driving over the road around 1 a.m., talking and having a good time. Then, on the side of the road, we saw a huge white dog wearing a gold chain, staring at us. We passed by and immediately asked each other if we'd both seen the same thing. We debated stopping on the side of the road to pick it up. The local legend is that if you see an old lady on the road, you're supposed to pick her up or something bad will happen. We didn't stop, and didn't speak again until we got home. I asked another local guy what that could have been. He said it was the goddess Pele's pet. I did some research, and it turns out this dog has been spotted sporadically since the 1950s. There was this abandoned house in the middle of nowhere, about 30 minutes of backroads to find it, with no other people for at least 10 miles in any direction. My friends and I used to go check out this spooky house and show it off to 1 or 2 new people at a time. We did this 3 or 4 times, and one night, as we were pulling up, a light in the house turned on. The house didn't have power any of the other times we'd been there, and there were no vehicles anywhere around the house that night. It scared us all to the point that none of us ever went back. In retrospect, it was probably being used as a hunting cabin or a meth house, although there was never any indication of either that we saw, and they might have just kept the breaker off when they weren't there. A car could have been parked in a spot hidden from the road. But as high school kids, nope. Spooky house with unexplained lights. I went to college in Providence, Rhode Island. My dorm room setup was pretty standard, just my roommate and I, with beds on opposite sides of the room and desks at the foot of each bed. One day, my boyfriend and I were hanging out in my room, and he was lying on my bed. I was standing next to the bed and bent over to grab something. Suddenly, he screamed and freaked out, covering his eyes, not exaggerating. He wouldn't tell me why at first, but eventually, he told me that when I bent over, he saw a shadow behind me that looked like him. He had an afro, so the silhouette would have been pretty distinctive. We didn't talk much about it afterward, and we never told my roommate, she wasn't there at the time. A couple of weeks later, I was asleep in bed with my boyfriend, and I woke up in the middle of the night to see my roommate packing a bag, looking panicked. She didn't see that I was awake, so I didn't say anything. The next morning, I asked her why she rushed out of the room in the middle of the night. She told me she'd woken up and seen my boyfriend sitting at my desk. She asked him why he was up, only to realize my actual boyfriend was sleeping next to me. She believed in ghosts, so she freaked out and left. That really shook me because we hadn't mentioned the look-alike my boyfriend had seen, and it sounded like she saw the same figure. Living in Rhode Island showed me some weird stuff. I worked in a nursing home for years during the night, and everyone always complained about weird stuff, like noises on the top floor. I didn't believe in any of that, so I was always the one going upstairs to do night checks. One night, I was changing a resident on that floor with a colleague, and he mentioned hearing something that sounded like people walking. We were in the resident's room, and I had to go to the cupboard at the end of the corridor to get bed sheets. As I was coming back, I kept hearing footsteps and what sounded like someone touching and opening plastic bags. I was so annoyed that I looked outside the room and saw a shadow passing down the corridor. The strange thing was that the shadow looked like a person walking by, and I heard footsteps and the sound of plastic bags. I freaked out so badly and froze completely. I had to call another colleague to come upstairs because I was too scared to come out of the resident's room. Bear in mind, I never believed in these things, and for 2 years, I was always the one doing night checks on both the top and bottom floors by myself. I'd never had any issues or seen anything unusual, but since that day, I never went upstairs alone and was always very scared. I'm a sous chef in a nice restaurant in Lexington, Kentucky. About a week before Christmas, 2 years ago, a starting cook with a history of seizures had a seizure while frying potato curls in the deep fryer. He fell into it, his entire right arm up to his shoulder, his face, his chest, completely immersed in 350 degrees Fahrenheit oil. I was the one who found him, maybe a couple of minutes after it happened. I pulled him out, resuscitated him, pulled off his chef coat as gently but as quickly as I could to avoid worsening the skin on his arm, and sprayed all the burn spray we had in-house to help relieve the pain. I stayed with him and talked to him as calmly as I could so he wouldn't go into shock. Someone called 911, and it took about 15 minutes for the paramedics to get there. As they put him into the ambulance, a paramedic took our head chef aside and said what I did possibly saved his life. He mentioned he'd seen a lot of burn victims, and that most people with burns like his lose their lives, that they go into shock and cannot recover from the pain. After emergency surgeries and eventually losing his right hand, he healed. I still talk to him as frequently as I can, and I am working through the PTSD I've experienced from it. That is probably the scariest thing I've ever witnessed. I house sat one summer for a couple who had a dog and a cat. The lady told me their dog didn't go into the basement. I assumed she meant he wasn't allowed, so I asked if there was a baby gate to prevent it or if he knew the rules, and she said, "He's allowed, he just refuses to go down there." He had no issues with mobility or anything in general, but I figured maybe he didn't like the linoleum or something. The guest bedroom was in the basement, so I tried not to overthink it since the cat had no issues hanging out down there and watching movies with me. One night, I watched a couple of scary movies and started to freak myself out, so I turned them off and went to bed. As I was lying there, I tried to pep talk myself by saying, "It's all in your head, don't let your imagination run wild." Instantly, I heard a loud pop of glass breaking. I got up and went to the bathroom, and when I turned on the lights, I found one of the light bulbs had exploded. I don't know much about electrical issues, so I figured it was just a terrible coincidence and that I was still letting my imagination take control. I went back to bed and continued to try and calm myself down, but this time, the second I closed my eyes, I heard another pop. It was a light bulb in the basement living room. I slept upstairs that night and never went back into the basement alone. Should have trusted the dog in the first place. We bought our house when the previous owner passed away. It was clear he had been a smoker, and in the corner of the room where his chair had been, there was a yellow stain on the ceiling when we moved in. Years later, when we had kids, each of them, as toddlers, would sit in that corner and seem to talk to someone who wasn't there. It really used to freak my ex-wife out. We asked the kids if they remembered this, and our middle child said she used to talk to the jolly man that smelled of smoke. Wish to God we'd never asked. This isn't my story, it's my uncle's. A bit of backstory: he used to work on the London Underground doing maintenance on the tracks and tunnels. Once, he went into a tunnel with two other colleagues. They'd stopped to do something, and a man said to my uncle, "Hey, uncle's name, can you show me the way out?" My uncle, thinking it was one of his team, replied, "You know the way out." I think he was so focused on his work that he didn't turn around right away to see who it was. Then the guy said, "I'm so cold," and my uncle immediately felt a chilling cold around him. The air dropped. Not sure exactly what he meant by that, but he described it as a sudden dead cold. So my uncle turned around and shined his light on the man. He told me this person looked like a ghost, holding a really old, vintage lamp and wearing a worn, dirty uniform. My uncle said the feeling he got was so strange, like he just knew this bloke was a ghost. The man kept saying, "I'm so cold. I'm so cold." Eventually, my uncle said to him, "I don't think you're supposed to be here, mate. Can you see a light anywhere?" The man looked right at him and said, "Can you help me? I'm so cold." I'm not sure if his colleagues came to see who my uncle was talking to, but one of them tried to approach, thinking it was someone in their team playing a joke, and the man just disappeared right in front of their eyes. All of them freaked out and ran. They refused to go back into that tunnel. My uncle and his two colleagues never went back down that tunnel again, and other colleagues said they'd seen the same man, who always says how cold he is. My uncle's retired now, but he says he still thinks of that bloke from time to time. I might have something for this. When I was young, probably around 10 or so, maybe younger, I was at a family wedding. It was late in the evening, so a full moon was out, and it was getting darker. My cousin, who's a year younger, and I were swinging on this big metal gate thing outside the venue. It was at the entrance to a very large field. We noticed a guy way out in the field who was just glowing, radiating white light. His skin, clothes, everything. I remember us standing there, like, what the heck? We tried to get his attention and shouted at him. He stopped, looked in our direction, and just stood there under the full moon, staring at us. We were frozen in shock and confusion. After about 10 seconds, he turned and kept walking across the field, eventually disappearing behind a swing set. Even to this day, I have no idea what that was. I'm hoping it was some kind of costume or something, but it sure didn't look like it. At one of my previous sysadmin jobs, we were closing down one of our smaller data centers, consolidating it into a larger one. We still had to keep someone on site overnight each week in case of server issues that needed handling in person. The rotation put each of us there for a week, and when I joined, I heard rumors that the place was supposedly haunted. No one knew by what, just stories from coworkers. Imagine a large, open office space completely void of all the usual cubicles, desks, etc., with just one desk and some random cables hanging from the ceiling. Only the lights over my desk worked, casting a small pool of light that bled out about 3 feet into the darkness. That was my spot for the week. One night, I was sitting there, listening to the ambient noise coming from the server room off in the distance, fans, cooling systems, the usual, working on a server for a customer. Then I saw something dart across the room in my peripheral vision. I looked up, saw nothing, and figured my eyes were tired from staring at the screen. I went back to work, but about 5 minutes later, I saw it again. This time, I also heard the bathroom door open and shut, a big, heavy door that you pulled open, and the mechanism at the top would pull it shut. Thinking a coworker was there to work on a server fix, I got up to greet them. I waited for about 10 minutes, but no one came out of the bathroom. Concerned, one of my coworkers suffered from seizures. I went in to check, but the bathroom was completely empty. Now I was creeped out. I left the bathroom, and this time I saw the shadow figure dart across the other side of the room, but I was looking at it head on, not in my peripheral vision. I quickly went over, threw the rest of the lights on, and started searching the whole office and server room, convinced a coworker was messing with me. I never found anyone. The rest of the night, and the rest of the week, was uneventful, minus me basically shitting bricks at my desk, waiting for something else to happen. I had a dog growing up who was the smartest dog I've ever known. She was like a human trapped in a dog's body. My brother and I found her wandering around our neighborhood after school, and we brought her home. She became beloved by everyone. My brother passed away young. After he died, she started doing something unusual. She would slowly walk in a circle around a plant we had in the living room, letting the hanging leaves gently brush her back. Every once in a while, she would stop, look up at the plant for a moment, like she was seeing something floating above it. She'd get a sad look in her eyes and let out a whimper. I'm convinced she was seeing my brother's spirit watching over us. I really loved that dog. Okay, so not something I saw, but something I was told someone else saw. Here's the story. My ex-girlfriend passed away years ago. Before she passed, my brother and I lived together, and he had a big pit bull named Max. Max was an awesome dog, and she was a big animal lover who knew Max well. Eventually, I moved out, and my brother got a girlfriend who had a kid and needed the space. Here's the key part. My ex-girlfriend had long blonde hair, was in her 30s, and she was buried in a pink sweater. A few months after she passed, my brother took his family on vacation and asked if I could watch the dog, feed him, etc. I said yes, of course. They kept Max in a crate in his girlfriend's daughter's room, a big basement room. I spent some time with him, but eventually, I had to go. I put him back in his crate and felt bad leaving him there. Before I left, I looked up and said, "Meg, if you're still around, please keep Max company. He's gonna be lonely." So I went home, my brother and his family came back, and that was that. A few months later, I was talking to his girlfriend, and the topic of ghost stories came up. She told me her house was haunted. I was surprised, since I'd been there plenty of times and never seen anything. She explained that it all started out of nowhere. She hadn't seen anything herself, but her daughter, who was around 5 or 6 at the time, told her that sometimes, when Max was barking or freaking out, she would see a lady about mommy's age with long blonde hair wearing a pink sweater, who would calm him down. I'm pretty sure I invited a ghost into their house, but honestly, I'm happy about it. I wish I could have seen her. As a kid, there was this camp way out in the Australian bush from the town I grew up in. It had a lean-to and an old plywood caravan against it. During one school holiday, my friends and I went for a bushwalk and stumbled across it. It didn't look like anyone had been there in months. We peeked inside the van, nothing much in there but some moldy seats, a built-in table, usual old caravan stuff, so we shut the door because it smelled awful. As we sat in the shade of the lean-to, we suddenly heard the doorknob on the caravan squeak and start to turn. Pretty sure my backpack is still sitting there 35 years later because I dropped it and ran. We all scattered in different directions and met up lower down the road an hour later, all still pale and shaken. There was no way anyone was in that van. No way. Still bothers me to this day. I was about 12 at the time. Every year, my parents and I would drive from Montreal to Nova Scotia to visit family. We'd always taken the Trans-Canada route, but for a change, we decided to go through the States, heading southeast through Maine and eventually into New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. I remember we were in a very remote area, hadn't seen a house for a long time. This was before GPS and Google Maps, so there was a growing concern in the car that we might run out of gas. I don't remember the name of the road, but it was a country road. On the right side was a steep mountainside covered in dense bush, and on the left, there was a steep drop-off with thick woods leading down to a river about 75 to 100 feet below. Trees hung over the road, so even though it was a sunny day, the road was mostly shaded, with only a few breaks of sunlight here and there. I heard my dad up front ask my mom, "What the hell is that up ahead?" I leaned over to look, and down the road, we could all see what looked like a man on the side of the road, way off in the distance. He was too far away to make out details, just a big dark shape standing there. As we continued down the road, this figure, or whatever it was, crossed both lanes in just 3 or 4 steps, then vanished into the woods on the other side. When we got to the spot where he'd crossed, my dad slowed down to look around, but there was nothing. No sign of anyone, no trail, nothing. None of us knew what we saw, but 30 years later, it still gets brought up every couple of years, and we all agree, still weird and creepy as hell. When Grandpa passed away, almost the whole family was around him in bed. He was 98, and we were waiting for the doctors because he was suffering. On the night table, we had placed some candles. Just a few seconds after he passed, the candle flames suddenly started burning intensely, reaching almost 10 times their usual height. It lasted for about 10 seconds before the flames went back to their normal size. I don't know if it was Grandpa's soul leaving his body or something like that, but it was strange and unexplainable. All my uncles saw it, but no one talked about it afterward. I was on a cruise with a friend, and we shared a cabin. My friend was a really loud snorer. Normally, He would stay awake until I'd fallen asleep, otherwise, I'd find it impossible to sleep with the racket he was making. But that night, he'd had a few drinks and passed out drunk, snoring loudly. It didn't bother me much, as I had my book to read. Around 2 a.m., I was still wide awake, reading in bed. Suddenly, I got this feeling that there was something at the foot of the bed. I glanced up, and there it was, this thing. It looked like a person, but translucent and gray, with blurry features. It was a bit like if a person were made of television static. I got the sense that it was being inquisitive, almost like a young child watching you do something with curiosity. In my head, I asked it what it wanted, and as I did, it turned and walked across the room toward the door. As it moved, it gradually disappeared. I didn't feel scared or threatened by it at all. I don't drink or take drugs, so it wasn't that, and I was wide awake. No idea what it was. Just odd. Really odd. Giant blue, almond-shaped, front-facing eyes glowing in the dark through a barbed wire fence. I lived on a forest property in a country with no large predatory animals. This was right after massive bush fires, so maybe something that normally lived deeper in the forest had been pushed out to the outskirts where we lived. Even the insects had gone dead silent, and the flight, fight, or freeze instinct was overwhelming. The local indigenous tribe told me I'd encountered a bunyip. I have no idea what it was, but I've never been so terrified. When I was a kid, my grandpa was the night shift custodian at a big, old-school church building. My sister and I would go with him sometimes because the place had a huge gymnasium-type room with lots of big exercise balls and other fun stuff to run around with. One night, while my grandpa was locking up a room, my sister and I heard a noise down the stairs behind us. We looked and saw an old lady leaving the building. She turned, looked right at us, did the hush motion with her finger to her lips, and then left. We didn't think much of it at the time. We went to my grandpa and asked if anyone else had been in the building that night, maybe for a meeting or class or something, but he said, "Nah, it's just us in the entire building." Then we asked him where the door down the stairs led, and he replied, "Oh, that goes out to the cemetery." My sister and I freaked out. We still talk about it to this day and have the exact same memory of it. About 15 years ago, I was in upstate New York with my uncle at our family house. It's pretty quiet up there, not a lot of people around. My uncle and I were outside when it started pouring rain, so we went inside. We were looking out the front door together, and my uncle was commenting on how hard it was raining. This is a rural area, so it was mostly pitch black, with only the front house light illuminating the area. As we're looking out the door, we both see someone speed-walking down the road. It was so dark, but their skin was so pale that we could see their hands swaying as they walked, and then their face as they turned toward our house. All I remember was that their face had no eyes. My uncle quickly shut the door and told me not to worry, saying it was probably just someone caught in the rain. I was scared, but he calmed me down. I was little, so I don't remember much after that, other than him keeping watch for a while. I'd forgotten about this until years later when I brought it up to him, thinking maybe it had been a dream. His whole attitude changed when I mentioned it, and he just said he remembered but didn't want to talk about it. I've never brought it up again, and even now, whenever I think about it, I get an eerie feeling. It wasn't what I saw but what I heard. I lived down the street from our town's cemetery, and my friends and I would often walk around on the paths there. Sometimes I'd see a car parked in the cemetery, but it was almost always empty. One day, my 3 friends and I were walking up a small hill in the cemetery when we all heard a knocking sound, exactly like someone knocking on a door. It was just one loud knock knock knock, only a few feet away from us, and then nothing. I looked at my friends, and we all asked each other if someone had made that sound. None of us had, and we couldn't have. We were in the middle of the road, with the closest tree or grave about 15 to 20 feet away. We looked around at the nearby houses, but there was no one outside who could have made the noise. It was creepy, and to this day, I have no idea how that sound was created. I was driving home with my family late one night after a day of skiing. My dad likes to drive fast, even in rough weather, and it had just started snowing heavily. We hit a patch of black ice, spun out, and started sliding toward what looked like a 30 to 40 foot near vertical drop into a wooded area. Right before we reached the edge, the area between the front and rear passenger doors crumpled completely, stopping us on the shoulder of the road. The strange thing is, when we got out to check, there was absolutely nothing there to hit, no guardrails, street signs, or anything else that could have caused that impact. It didn't even feel like a crash. I've been in accidents before, but we went from 65 miles per hour to a dead stop with the force of, say, pulling into a parking space. No jolt, no bang. We were just spinning, then came to an immediate stop. Another foot, and we'd have gone over the edge and likely wouldn't have made it. When we looked at the car, it was as if something had physically crumpled the side to stop us, like something out of an Avengers movie, if Iron Man had put his hand out to catch the car. It's hard to describe, but I'm convinced a higher power stepped in that night.